Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and today we have a fun question and answer for you. A writer asked me if the medical examiner could tell the type of knife that had been used in a murder. Now, she had very specific details about this knife and about this killer. The knife was unique in that it was long bladed and the blade was curved and it was serrated on one side. And the killer, his method of killing was to jab the knife into the middle of the abdomen, the stomach, the pit of the stomach, and then angle it up toward the left side of the victim, toward the heart, in order to get the heart. And then they would twist and turn and slash with the knife once it was inside. And this was kind of their signature. Now, another thing about the knife, it also had a handguard that was decorated a special way. So the question was, if this is done and if this person is doing this, can the medical examiner determine the type of knife that was used for this? Is there any way to determine that? Well, maybe. Let's talk about it a little bit. A knife wound in an ideal world, as far as the medical examiner is concerned, if someone stabs someone, it's a straightforward in and out. Bang, bang. Nothing else happens. It's a clean wound. And if you look at it from the outside, the external vision of the wound, it's basically like a little slice. It's an inch or inch and a half wide, and that's pretty much it. What can be told from that? Well, you can get the width of the blade. Is it a half an inch, an inch and a half, 2 inches? The ballpark can get that. What about the thickness? Well, you can tell whether it's a very thick knife or a very thin knife. Well, there's a couple of problems there. The skin is very elastic and it will contract back on itself after the knife is removed. And so it will look a lot smaller and seem a lot smaller than it actually was. Now, the younger the victim is, the more elastic the tissues are and the more shrinkage there is. So it's a best guess, as in most things in forensic science is a best guess. But an experienced medical examiner who's seen this before may be able to say, okay, it's approximately this width and approximately this thickness. Okay, fine. What about whether the blade's curved or not? Well, maybe, because the path that the blade takes into the body, is it straight in, straight out? Is it a banana effect? And in a curved blade, that may be the case. Okay, yeah, maybe you can tell that. Is it a single edge or a double edge blade? Well, might be able to tell that from the anatomy of the external wound. Is it one end a little thicker and the other end down to a fine point, or are they both down to fine points, which would suggest a double edge blade? Is it serrated? Well, there's a couple of different kinds of serrations. There's those that are actually on the blade itself. Think of bread knife. It has serrations on the edge so that you can slice the bread more readily. Okay, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Uh, think of if it's on the other side. If it's the other side of the blade, away from the sharp side, then you may see serrations there. And in that case, the serrations are along the top of the blade. Those are used, I believe, for fish scaling and removing hides and stuff like that. But can the medical examiner really see that? Maybe, maybe not. The other thing is that can he determine the depth, the length of the knife by the depth of the wound? You would think that would be fairly straightforward. And the answer is he can give you the minimum depth. Let's say it's a 4-inch blade that's driven all the way in. Sure. Then it's a 4-inch blade. It makes a 4-inch deep wound. But what if it's a 6-inch blade or an 8-inch blade and it's only put 2/3 or half the way in, respectively? Well, you got a 4-inch deep wound. What you can say is it wasn't a 3-inch blade, but you can't say it wasn't a 6 or 8-inch blade. So again, it's a best guess as far as that is concerned, with one exception that comes into play here. If the blade is driven all the way in, all the way to the hilt, as they say, to the handguard, and the handguard may bruise the skin around the wound so that it creates that oval pattern or square pattern or whatever the shape of it is, and imprints that in bruising on the skin, you can say, all right, we got a 4-inch wound. It's a 4-inch blade because we went all the way to the hilt. And in addition, if there is a pattern or a filigree or some kind of something in the on the handguard, that may imprint that pattern. Just like strangulation with a rope can leave bruises that give you the pattern of the rope. Same difference here. So in this circumstance, in the ideal circumstance, the medical examiner can probably make a best guess of the length of the blade, the width of the blade, the thickness of the blade, maybe whether it's serrated or not, probably whether it's curved or not, and at least the minimum, and in the case of the handguard bruise, the absolute length of the blade. That's a lot of information. That eliminates a lot of possible weapons and really focuses things more on exactly what they're looking for, so that if they find something that matches that description, then they go further. But there's some problems here. I said it was an ideal situation. Most people do not hold still when you're stabbing them. They tend to twist and turn and fight and scream and yell and scratch and bite and everything they can to get away, to get that knife out of them and to make sure it doesn't get another chance at them. So a war breaks out. And what does that do to the wound? Well, if they're struggling and trying to twist and turn and get away, the wound gets altered. The knife basically is twisted and turned and angled and levered and all this stuff, not by the killer actually doing that, but by the victim doing all that to get away from the knife. Now, in the circumstance of this question, the killer actually does that themselves. They want to twist and turn and slice and get up into the heart and open up the heart and make sure that the person dies. I mean, most killers, they figure they got one shot at it and they're going to do the best they can. So in an ideal world, a lot of this stuff can be answered. In the real world, it's almost never. So in a real stabbing with all of this stuff going on, the medical examiner may not be able to determine the length of the blade, the width of the blade, the thickness of the blade, whether it's serrated or not, single edge, double edge, all that stuff may go out the window. Okay. But there are a few things. I already talked about the bruise pattern, so that can give you a identifying characteristic of this knife if there is a pattern on that handguard and if it went all the way to the hilt. It will also give you the exact depth, the length of the blade. It will also can tell you whether if it's curved or not. Probably the medical examiner will be able to determine that even in these circumstances. So though it's not ideal, there's still a lot of information there. But there's more. There's more that the medical examiner can do. Oftentimes, particularly if there's not a handguard, the attacker cuts themselves. This is extremely common in murders using a knife. They cut themselves. Then what happens then? Well, they bleed and they leave their DNA there. And even though they may wash things up and scrub things up, it's in the clothing, it's on the skin, it drips on the carpet, on the bed sheet, wherever this happens, the back seat of the car, whatever. And all it takes is one drop, and all it takes is for it to be found, and all it takes is for it to be analyzed properly. And now they got the killer's DNA. That's huge, especially in this day and age. Okay, what else? Let's say they develop a knife, they have a suspect, and indeed that suspect has a knife that matches all these characteristics, that is consistent with the weapon that caused this murder. Pretty strong evidence, but not strong enough. It's consistent with. So how do you know it's not just a similar knife? So how can the medical examiner say it's not just a similar knife, it is this knife to the exclusion of all others? Well, I mentioned the killer's DNA. That's pretty strong evidence right there. At least it puts them at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. So that's kind of hard to wiggle out of. But more importantly, the blood of the victim will get on the knife, of course. It will also seep into the nooks and crannies of the handle. It will also seep into the little creases and the little gaps in between the handle guard and the blade. There's gaps in there, and blood seeps into there. Even if the killer then washes it, cleans it, looks great, shiny, everything's perfect, and hides it somewhere and it's found, often you start taking it apart, you get deep into it, and you find residual blood or at least residual DNA. And now you've got a knife in this person's possession that has the victim's DNA on it. Wow. That's pretty difficult to get around. It's kind of like ballistics match of the bullet. They got not only a 38 caliber, they got the 38 caliber. So in this case, they got not only a curved blade serrated knife with a handguard, they got the one. All right. One other thing. What if the tip of the knife, the blade breaks off in the victim? And when the medical examiner is doing the autopsy, he finds that. Very interesting. Then they find the knife and it's missing a tip. Now it's getting interesting, isn't it? But a lot of knives have missing tips. So how do you know it's this one? How do you know this tip belongs to this knife? Well, you look at them under the microscope and you look at their patterns and you realize that they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, that it's a perfect match. And this is what's called fracture pattern analysis. If you've ever broken anything glass or you've ever torn a piece of paper, anything such as that, every tear, every break, every fracture has its own unique characteristic. No two things break or tear or crack the same way. Fracture pattern analysis, when it is well done and you have a good samples to compare like this, is about as good as DNA and fingerprints because, again, no two things fracture the same way. So all of this is good. How can it be used in this story so that the killer might get away with it or might not? Well, let's go with the first. By using this knife and by wiggling around and doing all the things that were done, destroys a lot of the evidence that the medical examiner would rely on to determine the type of weapon used here. And he may not be able to determine, as I talked about, most of the things. And so consequently, they don't even really know what kind of knife they're looking for. So how are you going to find it? And so they find the suspect and he's got a knife. Okay. But if I don't know much about the knife that made the wound, how does this knife help me any? But maybe he can. The other thing is, of course, get rid of the knife. Put it somewhere no one's ever going to find it. Don't ever keep the weapon around as a trophy, for Christ's sakes. But killers do stupid stuff. And for goodness sake, if the knife has a cool handle pattern or something, don't take a picture of it sticking out of the victim and put it on Facebook. And people do stupid stuff all the time. So that's how things might happen. Well, how can they get caught? Well, medical examiner may be able to determine several things about the knife, like we talked about. They may find a suspect knife. They may find blood in the crevices and whatnot. They may find the killer's blood at the crime scene, and they may find a broken tip and use fracture pattern analysis to determine. So this is a great question. And it's got a lot of ramifications. Now, as most things in forensic science, they're a best guess. And this is wound analysis, and wound analysis is that. But this kind of gives you a feel for how the medical examiner approaches these kinds of cases and how he evaluates these kinds of wounds and comes up with some kind of determination on exactly what happened and how it happened. Not always perfect, but it does make for pretty good storytelling, doesn't it? It's a great question. I thank the author for sending it in. I hope all of you get something out of this, and I hope your brain starts spinning and say, how can I use this in my story? What components of this can I add to my story? So get out there and keep reading, keep writing, keep having fun, and try not to get caught.